Good afternoon, BAO family. I am Jabari Lamb, and I got a special guest right here. We got Baruti. We got Mr. Baruti here, and he's going to be doing an interview. Well, he's going to be interviewing me about why choosing Liberia. So, Brother Baruti, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, Jumbo Jabari, and good afternoon to our audience. Yes, I'm Baruti, and Jabari. It's very nice to meet you. I want to just say that in extension to a fellow North Carolina A&T Aggie. So
Yes,
glad to
that
be on
Aggie
your
pride.
platform. Oh yeah, Aggie Pride. Glad to be on your platform uh, today. And I thought that I would interview you on Liberia, of course. I've seen some of the programs that you have done, either talking about Liberia yourself or with other roundtable guests that had a discussion. And for today, I have a few ideas I'd like to throw at you in and about Liberia. But first, let me say that I wanted to list a few ideas about Liberia just from my limited knowledge and just reading, and a few tidbits of information. Then we can kind of launch from there, if that would be okay. So, Liberia, uh, country in West Africa, currently country having a population of just under 5 million people currently. In terms of the demographic breakdown, 5% of the population is listed as Americo-Liberian, which would be people descended from African people that were moved from the United States uh, to Liberia as a part of a repatriation effort. I want to also say that the American Colonization Society thought up the plan of having a colony of Liberia in the mid 18 teens, and they had an assortment of various kinds of people, slaveholders, abolitionists, and others that were white, that thought that the idea of taking existing freed Africans from the United States that live in northern states at that time would be best as a plan to rid the U.S. of free Africans. Some people thinking, okay, free Africans in the north would be a deterrent to the continuance of slavery in the South, so they just wanted to rid the U.S. of them. Some whites thinking that that slavery was wrong, and but there would be no future for Black people in the United States in a white environment. It would be best to have them to move on to an African space where they could do for themselves. So the African uh, Colonization Society came up with the plan of Liberia. The migrations happened 1822, and then the actual country was not officially recognized as an independent state till 1847. I wanted to also say, just from my readings, I just tried to make a small parallel of something between Liberia and Gabon, that after the British and French governments outlawed the physical transportation of Africans as slaves across the Atlantic Ocean, in, say, 1805 or 1806, something like that. They engaged in using their naval arsenals to track down ships that were doing the illegal transport of Africans from the continent to be brought to various ports in the Western Hemisphere to be enslaved. So they would take various Africans ships, and they would commandeer the vessels and then drop off Africans in what we now know as Liberia, and also in Gabon, particularly the port of Libreville. It is interesting that Liberia, the root word of it is liber, L-I-B-E-R, meaning freedom in Latin, and Libreville for Gabon, having the same root base as freedom. I also wanted to point out that I was reading an article from 2003 from the New York Times, and this article said an army of educators saves a Liberian college. I wanted to reference the Booker T. Washington Institute as the sole remaining college at that time during the Liberian War coup. And it stated that this college, named after Booker T. Washington of Tuskegee fame in the U.S., had a curriculum where students learned accounting, engineering, business, home economics, secretarial work, agricultural sciences, carpentry, plumbing, and a list of other skills that are listed as skills needed to rebuild the country. And in this article, that this was the only remaining college that survived the internal warfare at the time, and the vice principal of the institute had stated, just in recalling the history to someone, he said that the 16th president of Liberia, Charles King, had visited Tuskegee Institute in Alabama and in the late 1920s, and wanted to basically transport Tuskegee to Africa. And so this person had hired a person by the name of Robert Taylor, who was the first Black graduate of MIT, to design the campus and a course of instruction. And we know that that is significant because Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute formed the model for many of the African American universities in the United States that are based on STEM. I would like to point out A&T, our alma mater, is one of them. And finally, and it was mentioned in the article, it says Booker T. Washington Institute played a very important role in building this country, according to the vice principal. And he said that those people who built its roads, its bridges, its public works, and its banks graduated from Booker T. Washington Institute. And finally, I have a book with me that I had been reading. It's a book called Booker T. Washington and Africa: The Making of a Pan-Africanist. And why that is interesting is because it's written by a person by the name of Dr. Tyreen Wright, who is a history professor at the City University of New York, Medgar Evers campus. And last year, she was interviewed on the Dark Channel, Diaspora African Renaissance Channel, where sometimes I serve as a guest analyst, about her book and about Booker T. Washington. And one of the things that she pointed out is that Booker T. Washington was involved not only in Africa, but with Liberia to this extent during his life, or nearing the end of his life, rather, that in 1909 through 1911, there was something called the Liberia crisis, in which Britain and France basically wanted to encroach upon the physical space of Liberia to basically colonize Liberia, as Britain and France had done other countries in the region. And so Booker T. Washington became involved, according to her book, in trying to urge the United States government to not let the colonization of Liberia take place. And so Booker T. Washington was influential in doing that by convincing Teddy Roosevelt at the time and his successor, William Taft, that it would be in the best interest, particularly in the election of William Taft, that William Taft could depend upon Black votes in the U.S. who were Republican at the time, at least 3 million, if he kind of secured the notion that Liberia should not be colonized. And he worked out some kind of arrangement, loans and monies to Liberia, of course, and worked out something with the British and French governments with which they did not colonize Liberia. So hence, in history books, we always say, okay, the only two countries on the continent, on the African continent, that had not been colonized were Ethiopia and Liberia. And according to this book by Dr. Wright, Booker T. Washington had something to do with the influence to make sure that Liberia was not colonized. So, so having said that, I wanted to just see your reactions to anything I said, but just to kind of use this as a launch off point for you to give some thoughts on Liberia, and then I'll chime in with some questions that I have for you to extend the research that you've already done and to engage it.
Yes, so the first point that I would want to bring up is you relating to your Booker T. Washington point about how, Booker T. Washington was influential in trying to prevent the French and the British from trying to colonize Liberia. The British and the French at that time have been trying to do that since the 1840s. And one of the reasons why Liberia gained independence was because Great Britain specifically told the US that you need to claim this territory. Either they need to claim the territory or the country needs to gain independence. The United States was not going to claim Liberia. And so Liberia said, okay, we're going to gain independence. And so on July 26, 1847, Liberia gains its independence. However, what we consider modern day Liberia is not actually how Liberia was. During this time, from 1847 of its independence to around that 1909 period of the Booker T. Washington, the Liberia crisis, Liberia extended into the Galenas Coast, which was northern part of it, Sierra Leone, into some parts of Guinea and some parts of Ivory Coast. And over time, countries like France and Great Britain started to encroach upon that territory. And an example of this would be in the early 1880s, you had a man by the name of Anthony D.W. Gardner, Anthony W. Gardner, he was the president of Liberia at the time, and he resigns from the presidency because he gives up the northern territory known as the Galenas. Now, at this time, the British were sending gunboats to Liberia and basically said, you need to give us this territory. And it was ordered by the governor of Sierra Leone at the time. At this time, Sierra Leone was under the rule of Imperial Britain. They take the Galenas Coast, and then on the east side, as France colonizes Ivory Coast, parts of Ivory Coast and Guinea were part of Liberia. And so France starts taking little pieces of Liberia's territory in the Ivory Coast to where the Cabalas River is. It's where Maryland County is, which was its own country at the time, the Republic of Maryland. And so eventually it leads to what is called the Liberia crisis. Now, at the time when the Liberia crisis occurred, Liberia didn't have a lot of money. It was lacking in terms of African American immigrants. So not a lot of African Americans were able to go to Liberia because they either didn't have enough money, they didn't have enough resources. And so therefore Liberia's really its economic growth was really stunted. And so Liberia was not a ultra powerful country. It was a very weak country at that time. And so basically knowing that it can't defend itself really, the Liberian Frontier Force is in its infancy or is not yet created. That's when it's where the appeal of Booker T. Washington comes in, because you essentially need that U.S. military power to kind of deter France and Great Britain from trying to colonize Liberia, and sort of make it like any altercation with Liberia is going to lead to a war with the United States, which was something that Britain and France would avoid, because Britain and France at the time were allies. As it pertains to your second point, the colonization society. So Liberia, the idea of it goes all the way back to the 1760s, specifically 1763, when Granville Town, Sierra Leone was created. Eventually, that was not successful enough, and eventually the settlement is either destroyed or they disperse. There's a second attempt in the late 1780s, 1787 in particular, by a man by the name of Thomas Peters, who was a black loyalist who fought in the American Revolutionary War, who was born in North Carolina. He sails to London. He was originally in Nova Scotia, but they were struggling in Nova Scotia at the time because it was harsh winter. And of course, the white British loyalists were not treating the freedmen that had fought for them well. So Thomas Peters then goes to Great Britain, and then he basically gets permission to establish a place called Freetown in 1792. He doesn't stay too long because he eventually dies from disease in 1792 in Freetown, Sierra Leone, which then becomes the oldest African American city to be founded by African Americans, the oldest capital. 30 years before Monrovia. Monrovia would be founded in 1822, and next year will mark the 200th anniversary of the founding of Monrovia, which was at that time in 1822 known as Christopolis. But once Freetown is established, Paul Cuffey, who was the wealthiest black man at the time, he was part black and part Native American. And the name Kofi, is Ghanaian, is Asante in particular, or of a
Like
Ghanaian
Kofi.
tribe. Yeah.
Right.
And so Paul Cuffey is able to raise enough money and use some of his funds to ship 38 African Americans to Sierra Leone. And this sort of gets a lot of African Americans interested in going back to Africa. Robert Finley, the founder of the American Colonization Society, reaches out to Paul Cuffey, is interested in what he's doing, and basically says, okay, why don't you help advocate this, American Colonization Society to free blacks? So there were free blacks like him and James Fortin that originally supported the idea. Eventually, there's a protest by free blacks in Philadelphia. It was the first major black protest of Northern blacks at the time. And they protested against the American Colonization Society. Now, the reason why they were opposed to it is because the ACS is the abbreviation of the term. The actual full name of it is the American Colonization Society of Colonizing Free People of Color. That's the whole name of the American Colonization Society. And so it includes, like you said, of slaveholders. So slaveholders included James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, who was doing this back as far as 1773, and sent a letter to a British governor in 1802, although Thomas Jefferson gets rejected by that British governor when he tried to advocate for colonization of black people. Other people include Bourgeois Washington. Some of them were the Quakers. So, we have the Supreme Court Marshal and the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, who's an advocate for it. And so this is where it kind of gets suspicious. If this is supposed to benefit black people, why are slaveholders, advocating for this? And okay, you can go ahead.
Well, can I interject something? So it sounds like at the time that talk about Thomas Jefferson, 1773 or so, and others, during that time period, 20 years from then or so, that they hadn't figured out exactly, hadn't secured what land that would be the space for the colonization, but it was the idea that there needed to be a colonial space of which Black people could be shipped. Now, my I want to get your reaction to this when you referenced my comment about the slaveholders being a part of this. Just from my reading, is that the slaveholders felt like that some Black people, small numbers, of course, at the time, that were in the North, who were free, would be a negative influence on African people that were enslaved, particularly in the southern regions at the time. And so they thought that to get rid of what they thought was this contradiction and negative influence, they wanted to basically get rid of all of the Black people who were free in the U.S., ship them out, and then intensify policies at that point that would state that if you had any kind of Black person in the U.S., they would automatically be a slave no matter where they were. That's what they wanted. But there would be no contradiction in their mind that you might see one Black person in a particular area of the configuration of the U.S. at that time who was free, and there'll be no ambiguity about that. What would be your reaction to that? Is that accurate from your research about their mindset?
Part of it, but it's not, fully, it doesn't really fully tell the whole picture. So there were some slaveholders, and this is we're talking about the 1820s to the 1830s. So in the 1820s into the 1830s, there is this idea that, we should ship all Black people out, not just free Black people, but all Black people. Because they wanted to make a white nation. So that was originally, their purpose, was they wanted to make America this white nation.
Who
Eventually,
is this? Who is this? You mean those people who you mean there was a debate about whether the U.S. should just abandon slavery, period, and what to do with not
yes,
having to empty
yes.
the entire country of Black people if they decided to abandon slavery?
Yes. So a lot of the founders, the early founders, were what's called gradual emancipation followed by colonization. So you free the Black people over time, but you have somewhere to dump them. So essentially, it was the West Indies. Thomas Jefferson even suggested as far as the Mississippi River, west of the Mississippi River, Western United States. Some even pontificated North Africa, West Africa. The idea was you slowly emancipate these slaves and then you send them to a particular place. So most of those founders believed in what's called gradual emancipation followed by colonization. The major reason for that is because they were strongly opposed to miscegenation. That was one of the major, talking points of why they felt that Black and white people should stay separate was miscegenation. Another reason why was because they just felt that in their minds they could not see Blacks and whites living together. So their solution was gradual emancipation followed by colonization. And like I said, that is from the 1820s until we get to the 1830s to the 1840s. Once we hit the 1840s, as slavery becomes more and more profitable, this is when you start to see the calcification of slavery. This is when you start seeing from gradual emancipation and colonization to now slavery is good, slavery is moral, slavery is beneficial. So that time when Liberia was founded was based on the principle of gradual emancipation and followed by colonization. Eventually, there isn't. Okay, go ahead. You can respond to that if you want
And
to.
then obviously some whites who said slavery is wrong, who saw eventually maybe slavery could end, but you need to dump all the black people out of the U.S., even if they are freed, because they would not be able to survive in a white hostile environment, and it will be best to have a place to send them. Hence the notion of all these different players with different philosophical ideas seemingly at the table within this American colonization society.
Correct, and it's just slaveholders and free and white evangelicals. You had a lot of black pastors and slaves who wanted to go to Liberia because they thought it was their chance to, build a nation for themselves and build a nation for their ancestors. Being able to run the country, being able to vote. So it also galvanized a lot of black people. And it ultimately really broke down to, are you a black nationalist per se, or a, integrationist? And at this time, black nationalists almost exclusively endorsed going back to Africa. And this is where I made a video earlier. It was called Classical Black Nationalism and Modern Black Nationalism. This period is the classical black nationalist period. So this is defined as going back to Africa and establishing an African American nation state, which is what like the purpose of Liberia was meant for. So there were a lot of black players who supported the American Colonization Society because it was their gateway to going what they perceived as going back home to the land of their ancestors and establishing a nation of their own.
Okay. This is okay. I'm glad you mentioned that. I looked up some numbers in terms of the rough numbers about who immigrated to Liberia. The rough numbers are there were 15 from the period of 1822 to 1862. That there were supposedly 15,000 ex-African slaves from the United States who immigrated, plus it's listed as 3,000 people from the Caribbean, and I assume associated with that would be people that were on slave ships that were making illegal voyages across the Atlantic Ocean that had found themselves in Liberia as part of a dump off from these commandeered vessels on which they were on. But nonetheless, that somehow the population was small of the African people who were repatriated or patriated to Liberia, as for the reasons that you gave. Now, one of the questions that I'm very curious about is, okay, so the American Colonization Society, as we've come to know, secured the land of Liberia, regardless as to whether the sizing has changed or have been encroached upon, but whatever the original territory space, they supposedly negotiated this land with various chiefs. And so what I'm curious about is, when the land was negotiated, why was there a conflict that eventually ensued between these people who are Americo-Liberians, or whatever term they use for them, and the so-called indigenous, if the land space was supposedly to only be for these people who had been enslaved, who were coming in? Why wasn't it just a space just for them, so that there would be no other people on that space to encroach? And if the chiefs gave the land for whatever payment they got from the Colonization Society, or whatever the barter exchange for the giving up of the land, did the chiefs do this with the blessings of the people, uh, underneath their rulership, or did the chiefs do this and the indigenous people didn't like it? Let's see what you have to say regarding that.
So this is one of the biggest problems when we talk about Liberian history is people tend to homogenize the 16 indigenous tribes of Liberia. So there are 16 indigenous tribes. I'll list some example. You have the Kru, you have the Mandingo, you have the Bandi, you have the Bela, you have the Loma, you have the Vai, you have the Kron, you have the Grebo, the Jibo. These are some of the tribes. Pele. These are some of the tribes that were part of Liberia. I prefer to call them kingdoms because I don't like the word tribe, but kingdoms in Liberia or societies in Liberia at the time. None of these groups were homogenous. Many of these tribes were engaging in the slave trade. Some of these
Right.
tribes were waging war. Examples of this would be King Salboso. He was a very militaristic leader. You had, King Peter Zolu of the Gola tribe. You had, the Poro and Sande societies that eventually spread it out to different indigenous tribes, such as the Pele. So when people homogenize it, that's the problem. There were some tribes in Liberia that were like maybe the Day who were opposed to the Americos, and they might have waged war against them. And a matter of fact, there was a war between the Americo Liberians and the Day tribe. But there were some tribes that were willing to, or societies and kingdoms, who were willing to align themselves with the native, with the Americo Liberians. There were some examples, and if you read it, it's called Liberia, America's Footprint in Africa. They bring up a particular section where he made a particular king made a warning to any of the other indigenous kingdoms and societies that if they were to attack the American Liberian settlements, they were going to be met with force. And this shows sort of the individuality and the fluidity of these tribes because we think of race at this time because remember this is in Africa in the 1820s. This is before major colonization in Africa doesn't really hit till the Berlin Conference, and really it hard hits in 1914
Mhm.
when
Mhm.
Africa is completely colonized. So
Right.
at this time they don't know what race is. So in many of these indigenous kingdoms and societies they see us as nothing more than black white men or black Europeans because we dress Europeans, we're Christian, we speak English, and these indigenous tribes were, speaking their languages, they had their own forms of government. And so this is where sort of the clash starts to come in because you essentially have to figure out a way how to, work with the indigenous tribes, but also, keeping this land for yourself. Now, one of the things that people don't understand about is that you brought up correctly, only 15,000 African Americans
Yeah.
went there and 3,000 Caribbean.
Yeah.
At this time period, there were about 260,000 native population in Liberia at the time. Without the help and assistance of some indigenous kingdoms and society, the Americo-Liberian settlements would have been wiped out. So for people, okay, you can go ahead.
No. So let me just throw in something. So what you're saying is, I just wanted to make sure I'm getting this point correctly. So even though the land settlement was supposed to be only for them, meaning the expatriates or the former African slaves who would occupy this space. You're saying that they could never secure it because, as you said, various nations of African people were not on. Some were on board with the settlement, some were not. So therefore, the land space and the boundaries of it, which was supposed to be established, were not really necessarily completely respected, and were not without encroachment. So it seems as though the colonists or the new settlers were always under siege from day one, not just from warfare, but also the threat of being re-enslaved from the activities of some of the nations in the surrounding area engaged in the slave trade. I just wanted to make sure that I got that properly, and if you wanted to say any more on that, if I didn't.
Yes, and to further clarify, to say that it was strictly for African Americans would be deeply problematic, and it would be a form of genocide. You would basically, in order to make it solely for African Americans, you would have had to commit genocide. You would essentially had to have displaced the entire native tribe to make it strictly for African Americans. Obviously, that never happened. Native Liberians, even today, are like 95% of the population. So
Right.
they, they
But see,
there
that's
was
what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. I thought that the land appropriation was supposed to be that this space was supposed to be only for the Africans returning. Now, you saying that's not really so? That was not the mindset of it.
No, that was not the mindset. The mindset for African Americans was to make a home for their descendants. Home meaning the ability to govern, the ability to live freely. It doesn't mean to be just for them with nobody else. It meant that they were able to control the social, economic, and political spheres, such as how the government was formed, the flag, the capital, the military. This is what we mean by a home for our descendants, not so much not including the native tribes or indigenous tribes or societies or kingdom. It just meant that we were now going to be the owners of this land. We were going to control the means of production. We were going to be controlling trade. We were going to be controlling the laws of this society. And that might have included working with the Bai kingdom or the Pele kingdom or different confederations, even into northern Sierra Leone. But that was the intention of Liberia. It wasn't so much to make it solely like ethnically homogenous, but to make it a place where Africans who were enslaved could go to their land of their ancestors and live what they would see live their best potential. Now, there are two different versions of it. There were some African Americans who brought their Western mindset with them, which they thought, to make a great African nation, it needed to be westernized. And there were some African Americans who thought that, Africanizing ourselves would be better. Examples of this would be Stephen Allen Benson, the second president of Liberia. He was able to speak multiple native languages, such as Bassa, Gola. You had Austin Curtis, who was a Afro Native American, Black and Cherokee, it's believed, and he went to become a Vi chief. And some speculations even said that he was instrumental in the creation of the Vi language with Mamalu Bukwele, who was considered the major, founder of the Bai script and the Bai alphabet. So it really depended on their version of what they saw as, African. And so usually it was the latter. It was the Western style way of thinking. And this is sort of where tensions between the indigenous start to begin. But also, like I said earlier, the indigenous, since there is not a idea of race yet, they see Americo-Liberians as being foreigners. So their job or some of their missions is to overthrow them because they want to be able to control and dictate that area for themselves as well.
So, so see, okay, so this is an important point, and I'm glad you're clarifying this, because, okay, so let's say from the get-go, you've got this area, and the Americo-Liberians, for lack of a better term, are going there with the notion that they might not have their own country that's completely homogenous just with them. But essentially what you seem to be saying is that they will be in an environment, either a country that may have other people with it, but essentially you're saying they would have like governance of their own spaces within the territory. within a
Yes,
larger
yes,
territory.
because yes, and to
Okay.
clarify that, because you can then exchange ideas. So, since you are in control of this political landscape, this economic, and since you have social, economic, and political control, like the famous Mr. Holism says, then it allows for you to assimilate those indigenous tribes. So
But
you
how would
can
they
teach.
have? But how would they have political and economic control in a society that was supposed to have various people who had autonomy?
So how they would have social, economic, and political control would be one would be the economic and military advantages that you may have. So while this society may have, different states with autonomy, you can have a situation where there is one state that is particularly powerful and mighty, that they are essentially vassal states. So those places who are in the hinterland, as they call it, the interior of Liberia, while they may be have their own little autonomy because of the Americas Liberians' economic, social, and political might, they indirectly control aspects of what goes on in the interior. So in a way, it's a vassal state. So the Americo-Liberians occupied what we would call the coastline. So from Monrovia all the way down to Harper was traditionally where the bulk of the settlers lived. The interior is where most of the indigenous people lived. So the indigenous people still had their clans, they still had their, autonomy, but some of them had to pay taxes to the Americo-Liberian government. So even though they still have their chiefs or they still have their kings, they're indirectly ruled by Monrovia because of the power that the Americo-Liberians have. A similar analogy would be the Americo-Liberians are to the indigenous Liberians as China is to Korea historically. China being the major power and Korea usually being the tributary or vassal state. It's not ruled by China, but China indirectly controls and influences Korea in the same way that the American Liberians may not have directly ruled over the hinterland at that time,
Mhm.
or the indigenous tribes still have autonomy, but the American Liberians indirectly influence and control what goes on in the interior through the form of what we now call today as being soft power.
What gave the American Liberians this leverage, given the referencing to their small numbers, perhaps in comparison to either bigger states with other kingdoms or just other ethnic groups that had more people? What gave them this kind of leverage? Because when you mention China in relationship to Korea, we think of China as having a billion people, and we think of Korea, the two, North or South or combined, as having a much smaller population. So what gave the American Liberians this kind of leverage and this geopolitical and economic configuration that you're talking about?
Yeah, so in the similar the way that China and Korea is in how China influences Korea, we also have in this time period, which is going to make reference to how the Americo-Liberians gain an advantage, would be the example of Japan. So Japan at this time and eventually goes on to become a powerhouse, has its own empire. But Japan is like 10 times smaller than than China, but yet Japan was still able to take vast swaths of China and also Korea and form an empire. Why? Technology. At the American Liberians, because they had influence with the Western world, had Western technologies that the indigenous Liberians were not exposed to. So an example would be, yeah, you do have a lot more people, but we have guns and we have boats. You have spears, you have arrows. That's not going to go down well. It's one of the major reasons why Europeans were able to colonize Africa, even though they had small numbers, because they were technologically more advanced. So even though the Americo-Liberians were small in number, because they had an understanding of what a nation state was, because they had access to Western technology, and they did have to a certain extent access to Western capital, they were able to take advantage or have a major upside compared to the indigenous tribes, who some of them didn't have access to that. They didn't have access to guns, or they didn't have access to these kind of housing architecture. So that's where the American Liberians, despite their small numbers, were able to control, vast swaths of the country.
Okay, when you mentioned that, what came to mind is the name of a person named Lot Carey,
Yes,
who was killed in an explosion in one of the Americo-Liberian settlement forts, for an explosion of gunpowder. So when I was reading about that, so obviously that was part of the war protection measures, gunpowder, making bullets, guns, etc., to protect oneself. So it says, it sounds like, is this in your mind part of the mentality about the rift? When I mean the rift, not just because the Americo-Liberians had, as you defined it, superior technology, but the reaction psychologically as years went on of these different ethnic groups who would interact with them, who would come to be part of this Liberia space as it became a geopolitical figure and country in the modern sense, about looking at the Americo-Liberians as feeling like they're superior to us. They think that they're better than us, or jealousy, or reverse ideas from the Americo-Liberian perspective of feeling like, yeah, we want to perhaps integrate with these people that's indigenous, but we feel, meaning the Americo-Liberians, superior to them in various ways. Look at us, we're only 5% of the population, but we control them in the same sort of way as was the case in what became British Central Africa, Rhodesia at the time. 10% of the population, a little under, that were white Europeans from Britain, who said they're ruling over 90% of the other population of Africans. Or in South Africa, the Boers, white, and English white people, saying they're a small portion of the population and they feel superior over the indigenous Africans, saying, yeah, technology over them is because they're smarter than the so-called native Africans. Is that
So some of the many Americos had the idea that the natives should assimilate, but it did come from a prospect of superiority. So the natives, the American Liberians did think that they were better than the natives. Some of them call them aborigines. Some people, of course, call them natives. Some people call them backwards, primitive, because they associated Africanness, indigenous Africanness, as being backwards. Many of them, like you said, Kari, one of the reasons why they came over there was to, quote, Christianize and civilize the indigenous Africans, because they saw African culture as being inferior. And this is where I say you have to make the distinction between classical Black nationalism and modern Black nationalism. Classical Black nationalism is a form of Black nationalism, but it's rooted in Western thinking. So they wanted a Black Western style republic. They wanted a Black Christianized Africa. So they don't.
colonization, colonizer mentality? Is that what you would replace with historical Black nationalism?
Um, you can use colonizer in a loose term if that's what you would feel is appropriate. Um, for me personally, I wouldn't say colonize, because one, Black Americans don't have a mother country, and you have to have a mother country. The second thing about colonization is you're usually shifting goods back to the mother country, and most
Okay.
of the time, Liberia didn't export hardly anything to the United States. Most of the time, it was importing stuff.
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't like when people compare it to Rhodesia and South Africa because there was no de jure and de facto segregation between the Americans and the natives.
Right.
Um,
But I'm talking about the
so,
mindset about the white man being superior and
oh, if you're
with
talking about in
smaller
terms of
numbers.
if you're talking about in terms of Western culture, then you can make a little bit of that argument. But if you're looking at it from the strictest sense of it,
Right.
no, you can't compare Rhodesia and South Africa to Liberia. That's comparing apples to oranges. So
No,
they did have a
right.
superior mindset, and they did come in smaller numbers. Now, the thing that
That's what I
people,
meant. That's what I meant. That's what I
yeah.
meant. The notion that the white man could control large portions of Africans with smaller numbers because they were technologically advanced because they were more intelligent.
I disagree on that. I push back on.
That's what I meant. I mean, if you're saying in Liberia, if you're saying that the
The reason why I
superior
have a problem
technology,
with that, the reason why I have a problem with that notion is because now we're heading into the slope in the argument where I can now bring that to Ethiopia and other regions like Eritrea and Djibouti. I can bring that up with smaller African kingdoms that eventually merge into vast African empires.
okay,
And they could then say, so then you start turning this colonization into, well, technically we can say that about some tribes that colonized other neighboring tribes. We can then say Ethiopia colonized the Horn of Africa if we're going to use that metric. So
okay, I see.
that's where I say that's a slippery slope because they were doing theirs to try to uplift their entire population. They might
Right,
have had a small number, but their goal was to assimilate the entire population.
right,
Whereas if you compare it to South Africa and Rhodesia, the white South Africans
right,
and Rhodesians had no intentions
right.
of trying
Okay,
to uplift um their
okay,
population. Now like Teen Swahili Worldwide said, there is a such thing as internal colonialism. So if you're talking about internally, like what I said with those tribes, yes, there is a term as being internal colonizers. But if you're talking about like colonization as in like white South Africans, white Rhodesians, Europe and France, then no, you cannot have that.
right. And I think in the point that you're making, somehow or another, the mis misnarrative, I may say, that some people have gotten is that the Americo-Liberians went there, saw themselves completely better than the so-called local people, wanted to just colonize them as the white man would colonize other areas, and really had no thoughts about the uplift of the whole region, and really just saw the so-called native peoples as slaves, although of the same race. And somehow those missentiments, I think, paint a bad picture. Do you sometimes get the impression that those
Yes,
misstatements?
the misnarrative, and this is where I keep emphasizing that words matter and definitions matter. So, if you want to talk about, like I said on the screen, like Teen Swahili Worldwide said, as internal colonialism, the Americo-Liberians committed internal colonialism, then you can make a little bit of an argument and a case of that. However, there were many Americo-Liberians that did learn indigenous languages. Like I said, you had Stephen Allen Benson. You had people like William V.A.S. Tubman that learned indigenous languages. You had people like E.J. Roy, who was almost of pure Igbo descent, and he wanted to assimilate the indigenous tribes. He wanted all the tribes to come together. He wanted to build a railroad in the interior of Africa. So it's not similar to what white people did. And that is a misnomer that I push back on heavily. No, Liberia was not like South Africa. It was not like Rhodesia. It's not like Israel. Okay. So when people use that, I have to push back because it shows
Right.
me that people don't know what definitions are. So Liberia, like I said before, if you want to look at it from an internal colonial, as in they thought of themselves as being, superior because they had received Western education or they had Christianity and they wanted to, assimilate them or basically help them adopt their form to create a Black Western Republic.
Mm-hmm.
Then you could, if we're looking at it from that framework, yes. But if you're looking at it from, oh, the Americos didn't care about the indigenous people, that's not true
It's not true.
because there were many annual inauguration speeches where the Americo-Liberian president specifically wanted to assimilate with the indigenous tribes. You had a man by the name of Alfred Francis Russell, who was 1/16th Black, by the way. He was a Black man who allowed Grebo tribesmen, or what I would say Grebo representatives, they say Grebo tribesmen, but Grebo representatives, into the parliament at that time. These were indigenous people who were part of the House of Representatives. So to say that they were trying to, do something similar to South Africa or Rhodesia, it's just complete misinformation, and
Right.
it shows that people don't know the specific details of Liberia.
Who do you think, or what apparatus, who or what apparatus do you think has been largely responsible for the misnarratives that mischaracterize the interface of relationships there?
The biggest people who push this misnarrative is mainstream media, but also mainstream website articles. When people talk about Liberia, they give this super ultra brief, thing about Liberia, and they don't go in depth. They bring up like, oh, the Americo-Liberians they enslaved the natives when that was not true at all. They abolished slavery. They stopped the slave trade within Liberia. They helped get African captives. To say that, oh, the Americo-Liberians oppressed the natives, made them citizens until 1904, when natives were historically their own separate autonomous regions and they still had their chiefs. Hence, Madame Sokoko, she gave up her rule over the area to the Americo-Liberians, even though she was the chief of the leader of that tribe. So, or kingdom, as I should say. So, yeah, the Americo-Liberians may have sort of not developed, and I think people need to misconstrue those two things. The Americo-Liberians, yes, they did, make them citizens till 1904, and then of course 1951 when all natives were able to vote. But the biggest reason that led to the coup d'état was massive inequality within the Liberian system. So it was not that the Americo-Liberians were being particularly hostile or looking down, but that the Americo-Liberians were not developing infrastructure in the hinterland. They were not developing roads. They were not developing power lines. They were not putting in those infrastructure that was necessary. It was more of a class divide, not of a tribal divide. And a Monrovia article made that good point by saying, yeah, for Liberia at the time, for the really rich, it was the best place on planet Earth for Black people. But for extremely poor residents, it was the rougher time that led to the rice riots in 1979. And then eventually, led to the subsequent coup d'etat in 1980. So it was not so much, oh, the Americo-Liberians. And even when one documentary they brought up the point where they said the ruling elites. That's a class divide. They didn't say the Americo-Liberians. They said the ruling elite. The ruling elite may have been significantly Americo-Liberian, but they were also indigenous people in the ruling elite as well. So it
Right.
was more to do with class structure and inequality rather than, strictly
Ethnic.
along tribal lines.
But somehow or another, the narrative has been misspun to say
Yes,
that it
it's
was
been
all
spun.
ethnic.
Yeah,
Okay.
they make it spun that, oh, the Americo-Liberians were treating the natives just absolutely atrocious, like similar to South Africa, one where we were not doing massacres like that. We were not declaring war on natives. We weren't ethnically cleansing them. We were not removing them from their homes to make for more ample room for African Americans. None of this happened in Liberia, but people want to conflate things to give this false narrative or these false equivalencies when it's a lot more intricate, it's a lot more complex, and people need to take the time to do the research and actually do a step-by-step analysis.
Okay. Today, if you let me ask you a question. Um, are you naturally a Liberian? I mentioned that only because if what is the reason, say, for the stoppage of, I don't know, citizenship automatically in Liberia for, African American peoples now? And if there isn't any stoppage or shouldn't be, are you naturally a Liberian, even though you might be classified as an African American in the geopolitical sense of the United States?
I have a personal story about that I can definitely attest to how I feel naturally Liberian. Was I was part of the organization called the Liberian Community Association of Greater Charlotte. And I was having conversations with Liberians. Some of them were born in Liberia, many of them did their education in Liberia, and we had a discussion about Liberian history. And I was bringing up all the information like I was telling you before, and they were floored by it. And they said, wow, this is information that I did not know. And then some of the information, um, they had never heard of, and some of the information they did heard of it, but they were never being told, or most African Americans didn't know that. And then when I said I would defend my country, I would defend Liberia. I stand by Liberian history. I know my history. I will answer the questions. I don't back down. A lot of them were giving me, compliments, saying they appreciated, what I was doing. I was bringing that fire and that I needed to preach. And then I had a conversation with her afterwards, and she said, my Liberian brother, you are definitely Liberian. We were having a conversation about, what tribe you should belong to. So yes, I do feel naturally Liberian, and there's nothing stopping African Americans from getting automatic citizenship in Liberia. It was actually written in the 1824, and 1839, in some aspects, the 1847 constitutions of Liberia. The 1986 constitution is the recent one that was really written by Samuel Doe and the People's Redemption Council. So that's where that where that little friction comes from now. But there have been Liberians who've advocated automatic citizenship for Black Americans. There was even an article on TLC Africa where she said automatic citizenship for Black Americans in Liberia. And there was another Liberian who said that we need to reach out to our brothers and sisters from America because our founders were from America. And if you've talked to a lot of Liberians, they know about this, and they want to connect, but we don't, as African Americans, study Liberian history full and depth enough. We don't study that 10 of the presidents were African American, and we're not making the investments in times the way that other people do. We're not creating diaspora funds to Liberia. We're not investing in the politics of Liberia. We're not investing in the Alternative National Congress with Alexander Cummings. We're not speaking to Joseph Boakai. We're not speaking to George Weah. We're not speaking to, Darius Dillon or Henry Costa. We're not investing, and that's what really prevents that automatic citizenship for African Americans. Is we need that engagement.
So what would you do now to say, I don't want to say Liberia 2.0, but let's just say for the engagement, does it need to be Black lobby in the United States to make sure that efforts are made to create additional infrastructure or influence what needs to be done in that sense, and what are any tension barriers that may exist now? I mean, do you think that the population is open to receiving more engagement from the so-called African American population, or
Yes.
infusing more of a population there of African Americans that don't exist there now but would repatriate? What do you think?
Yes, I don't like when people say Liberia 2.0 because that implies that Liberia was a failure, and it wasn't a failure. Before 1980, it had the second fastest growing economy in the world, only behind Japan. Liberia was home to Maya Angelou, who eventually moved to Ghana only because her son got in a car accident. Bill Russell lived in Liberia. He went there every summer and was planning after his basketball career to immigrate there. Nina Simone stayed there. She really wanted to go back to Liberia. She didn't want to stay in France, based on what I've read. She wanted to live in Liberia because she said, it was where she could be African American. There were a lot of African Americans who wanted to move to Liberia but just didn't have the funds. Benjamin P. Singleton, Marcus Garvey, Henry McNeil Turner. And so I don't see Liberia as a failure. I see it as a success that never really reached its full potential. And I feel like we can better it. And so I do believe that Liberia it would be open for us because that would mean millions of jobs for natives that are there. It would also increase the living standards for natives, and it would allow for us to reconnect that long lost connection that we should have had a long time. The only concern really is that make sure that we invest in the infrastructure, make sure that we provide jobs and opportunity for the people because that's really, you know, what they want us to know because Liberians are mixed identity. A lot of Liberians I know have Congo and another indigenous tribes. So they are mixed in with the Americo population.
Right.
Um, and they're not going to be anti because they know the history that this country was founded by us. So we just need to just basically form one unified identity. And then once you find that unified identity, that takes care of it. That takes care of any ethnic divisions. That's really all you have to fix. Just provide the infrastructure, create a unified identity, which is more and more starting to become, and we're going to be good. And I don't see a problem with Black Americans moving en masse to Liberia, especially knowing that 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 we can bring professionals that are needed. The fact that Liberia doesn't have access to many doctors, doesn't have access to many engineers, where we can provide that, we can help renovate the crumbling infrastructure that has not been rebuilt due to the Civil War. So yeah, that's where I stand on that.
Well, I find even the term. Well, let me say this. Do you find the term? I find the term Black American problematic in certain ways.
I do
I know
too.
we're just having a conversation, but let me explain what I mean. To
It's
me,
not
that
original. It's not original.
right, but right, and I want you to comment on that. But let me say this: I find it problematic because, to me, in its use, particularly its use now, given all the movements that's trying to say that Black people who live in the United States are not African, they use the term Black American to signify that we're not African. So there's nothing seemingly about the term that suggests Africanness, that one would want to reach out to an African nation and say, I'm connected and I'm part of you. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing is just in general about the term African American, which does have the term African in it, but nevertheless, I want you to comment on the term Black American, but also on this term African American. Do you think that this term is problematic in some way? In other words, um, is there something
Ah,
about how it's used that doesn't
yes,
make us an ethnic group or doesn't make us a people? Do
yes.
you think we'll be better
So
off to say we're Liberian within the
I
U.S.? And
I
tell
I
me your
think
thoughts.
I think it would be better if we did identify ourselves as Liberian Americans instead of saying, strictly African American, because like people have said before, when you say African American, that implies you're from Africa. Well, Africa has 54 countries. And
Mhm.
so, some people might ask, well, it's like some Africans, when I go to Africa, they'll ask me, because I've been to South Africa. I said, oh, I'm African American, I'm Black American. They're like, oh no, where are you from? And what they're saying is, what
Mhm.
country are you from? Are you from the Congo? Are you from uh
Mhm.
Zimbabwe? Are
I
you
see.
from Nigeria? So if you said, oh no, I'm Congolese, oh, I'm
I
Nigerian,
see.
then
I
it
see.
destroys that
I see.
ambiguity. When you say Liberian American, since Liberia was founded by free slaves with the help of indigenous people, and the presidents were African American, by associating African Americans who live here with
Mhm.
Liberia, that
Mhm.
destroys any ambiguity. So when I say I'm Liberian American, my connection is with the country of Liberia, because where my ancestors are from, that really destroys ambiguity, because people can point to a map, okay, this is where they're talking about. It has a
Mhm.
specific flag, and so
Mhm.
it's easier to identify. And then we can start being more exclusive, because we can say, listen, you're not Liberian. But when you say, oh, I'm foundational Black American, or I'm ADOS, well, then here's the thing that somebody like me would ask them. What and they seem to have this cognitive dissonance about it. What happens if I'm a, say, Mana American, which are African American descendants from the Dominican Republic, and I
Right.
come here to America and I say, listen, I'm from the Samana Peninsula. My granddaddy was from Pennsylvania, New York. They were free slaves, and they moved to
Yeah.
the Dominican Republic.
Yeah.
Are you then going to exclude me? Well, you say, no, you're Dominican, but ethnically, I'm related to you. We share a common heritage. But no, see, you
Mhm.
didn't go through Jim Crow.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
not culture. That's not ethnicity. And I feel like that's why the terms foundational Black American is
Right.
so problematic. Even when they talk about, oh, we're indigenous, we have indigenous blood and we were here in America. That is problematic in and of itself, because if you were
Right.
here before the slave trade, you would have your own language, you would have your own customs. You wouldn't call yourself foundational Black Americans.
Mhm.
We can see this even with Native Americans. They don't call themselves Native Americans. They
Right.
call themselves by their tribal nation. Cherokee Nation, Catawba Nation, Yamasee Nation, Seminole Nation, Creek Nation. It's a unique identity, Choctaw,
Mhm.
and they're
Mhm.
unique to them,
Mhm.
and they have their own language. Similar to me, I'm Gullah Geechee. Gullah Geechee, the southeastern part of South Carolina and Georgia. So
Right.
that's a specific term, and it's a unique term. Gola, Gullah coming from Gola, which means Angola or the Gola people in Liberia, and then you have Geechee.
Right. So
Okay,
you're saying, I'm sorry, go on, go on.
no, go
I
ahead.
had
No,
a
that's all I had to
thought.
say.
So let me revisit something. Maybe you already made this clear, but I just want to sort of illuminate this for a minute. So you're saying that that this term African American, as an example, is not specific enough because it does not connotate nationhood,
Hmm.
nationalist. Because if
Yes.
you're using the term Africa, it's a continent, and therefore is not specific to a nation state. So that
Yes,
if,
because
say, for example,
it's similar to like saying to Latinos. If you say, well, I'm
yeah,
Latino, you can ask a
yeah,
Latino person, okay, what's your nationality? Oh, my family's from Nicaragua. Oh, my family's from
I
Cuba.
see.
Oh,
So
my family's from Dominican Republic. You
I
can
see.
break it down.
So if you ask somebody and someone define them as a big group and said Latino, but the individual person was asked, okay, what's your background? They're not going to say, well, I'm Latino. If it had already been established that they were Latino, they'll say, okay, my background is Mexican or I'm Nicaraguan, etc. Much in the same way, I guess you're suggesting,
Same thing with Native
let's say
Americans.
in
We can
South
apply also to
Africa,
Native Americans in
right,
South Africa as
right,
well. Ask a Native,
Right.
yeah, I'm Native American. Okay, what's your tribe? Okay, I'm Cherokee. Oh, I'm Navajo.
Right.
It, it, it,
Right.
it, it,
Right. Well, now, okay. Now, let's follow this for a second because I want to make a point on that. So, like, let's say you're in South Africa, and as you said, someone asked you, okay, what's your background? You said, okay, African American, and they said, and they were thinking in their mind, okay, well, that doesn't really tell them where you're really from, right? So that if you had, let's say, a person from Kenya that moved to the U.S., stayed in the U.S. for 15 years or so, got citizenship in the U.S., and someone and they visited South Africa, you're probably suggesting that someone asked them, well, what's your background? They wouldn't just say African American. They would just say, I'm Kenyan, but I live in the United States. So if that be the case, and this term African American doesn't suggest a specificity when it came to national identity, that is the point that these people who identify themselves as FBA, Foundational Black American, I mean, I have a problem with the entire acronym, but
same.
they're saying they're being specific. They're saying that they are identifying what they would consider a tribe.
Okay, but
How
tribe
would
and
you
that
respond to that?
my response would be tribe and nationality are not the same thing, and that's one of the things that they're missing. Tribe and nationality are not the same thing. They are not mutually the same, and most of the time they're exclusive. Before I get to that, I want to get to Kaylin Bowler's point when she said, when I went to Zimbabwe and South Africa, I had so many brothers and sisters trying to figure out where in Africa I'm from. Exactly the point that I was bringing up earlier. That's why I prefer that we identify with the nation state of Liberia, because they're going to ask you specifically, like I said before, are you from the Congo? And unless you elaborate really to them, I'm African American, and that's because of the slave trade, and as a result, we don't know where I'm from.
Right. That creates
Then
problems too.
yeah,
That creates a
and we can also
mental idea that
and
you're confused about your origins.
yeah, and also, well, Jamaicans can say the same thing because Jamaicans were taken from Africa. They don't know exactly where they're from,
Right.
but when a Jamaican says, I'm Jamaican, it's a
Right.
nationality. People don't have ambiguity on what a Jamaican is. They know
Right.
what a Jamaican is.
Right.
So this is where nationality plays an important part. And that's why Liberia is important. Since Liberia was founded by African Americans, it represents that nation state. Another similar analogy would be Israel.
Right.
Israeli, and like I said before, how tribe and nationality are not the same thing.
Right.
Jewish and Israeli are not the same thing. Okay, they're not the same thing. A person can be a Jew and not be an Israeli. A person can be an Israeli and not be a Jew. But Israel is seen as a Jewish state.
Right.
So when Jews think of going home or having a connection, they're talking about to the state of Israel. They don't have to be Israeli, but they know that Israel symbolizes the Jewish state. So compare this to Liberia again. Liberia does not mean African American, but Liberia symbolizes an African American nation state. So if an African American lives in America but doesn't know their heritage, and they say, well, since Liberia was founded by free slaves, I claim Liberia, people know what you're talking about. And there's no more ambiguity. When you
I
hear
see.
FBA and ADOS talk and they bring tribe and nationality to the same thing, that's when it becomes a problem, because a person can be Yoruba and
Right.
live in Benin
Right.
and live in Nigeria as well. They're from the same tribe,
Right.
two different nationalities. Nationality and tribe are two different things, and people
Can,
need to break it
can you
down.
okay, so let's say we go with your point that you would like to be, say, identified. Can you think do you think that you and other people here can say they're Liberian American if you have not been given official citizenship in Liberia? Or are you saying also that you would just say Liberian American, regardless as to whether you are or are not a citizen, just as a point of reference? You know, kind
Yes,
of like
I
in the
would use
same way
that.
that an Italian person in the U.S. may say, "I'm Italian American," and someone says to them, "Well, where were you born?" And so I was born in the United States. And someone says, "Well, have you ever been to Italy? Do you have citizenship there?" And they'll just say, "No, neither, but I have ancestry there, so I just say I'm an Italian American." Is that what you mean when you say I'm a Liberian American, just as a point of reference on the continent?
Yes, yes, but also it's also we can compare it to Israel again. Theodore Herschel was Theodore. I forgot how to pronounce his name, last name, who was the founder of Zionism.
Herschel,
Was talking about
Theodore Herschel.
yes, yes,
Mm-hmm.
who was supportive of the creation of the Jewish state. Um, Even and he was also supportive of African Americans having their own country because they had been victims of the transatlantic slave trade. But we talk about the state of Israel, an example, because most African Americans bring that up. Israel tries to make connection with diaspora Jews who've never been to Israel, don't even speak Hebrew, and yet they will still reach out to them. They will go out of their way. They had a diaspora day. Mind you, like I said, there are Jews who don't even worship Judaism, who don't even speak Hebrew, and yet Israel will still reach out to them. Israel will still try to represent them. You have Jews in America today who have never been to Israel, are not Israeli citizens, yet they want to demand stuff from the Netanyahu and Israeli government. There are Jews who are condemning what the Israeli government is doing, even though they're not born in Israel, because
Mm-hmm.
Israel is supposed to symbolize something.
Mm-hmm.
It's not supposed to be just because I'm not Israeli, that doesn't mean I don't have a say in Israel's politics. I'm a Jewish person and I support the concept of the Jewish state, of that being of Israel. And so I have just as much of an involvement in that country as somebody born in Israel, the same way that Israel tries to influence American policies. And so that can be applied to African Americans today.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to be born in Liberia or be Liberian citizens for Liberia to reach out and say, we are the amalgamation. We are your representatives. When
Okay.
we go out on the world stage, we represent African American interests. We represent African American history, culture, value, and the Pan African spirit that galvanized so many African political leaders to come to this country. The OAU, the Monrovia Group. That's what Liberia should be representing to us.
So what
Bob
is it?
Johnson said the same thing back in 2008.
So what is it? What does it mean in your view for a people such as us in the United States that, let's say, are mislabeled, misdefined, um, to not be, let me say, to not be connected with a nation, or to not be thought of as international. Um, in other words, if we say the names like FBA don't in any way solidify one's Africanness. By the way, they use these terms FBA and ADOS deliberately to signify that they're not African and want to be disconnected from Africa. So they certainly would be diametrically opposed to what you're saying, to be classified as Liberian American, because Liberian American states that you are African, want to be African, and connect to an African country. But nevertheless, what does it mean psychologically, or from a power perspective or lack of power perspective, for a group of people such as us to not be thought of as international, meaning having a country that they connect with outside of the United States from a national perspective. What does that mean to you?
Okay, I want to respond to Michael Myers. He says FBA and ADOS use those terms for reparations' sake. From my understanding, being exclusive to get reparations for our descendants is a must. But once again, you're defining tribe, and tribe and nationality are not the same thing. What happens if a Trinidadian who's the descendant of of the Americans who are African Americans who left in 1812, and um they're here and they're Trinidadian American, are you going to be exclusive because they're part of our tribe? Okay, that's the problem that we have. And then what happens is people start to keep moving the goalposts. Well, then at that point, then people are going to start signing you because you keep moving the goalposts. Okay, when you say we are a specific tribe, you said
Yeah.
tribe, that means a common lineage. Okay, that means we're all the descendants of slaves. It doesn't matter if you're in Trinidad and Tobago, if you're a descendant, if you live in the Bahamas, if you come from American slavery, you are part of that tribe. To say, well, they didn't go through Jim Crow, you're completely changing the definition of a word. That's not what ethnicity means, and that's
Right.
not what tribe means. Okay, so
Right, but they're trying to use it that way to only talk about Black people supposedly in the United States. But I also do not believe that these terms FBA and ADOS gives them any more leverage to get reparations than not using. I don't know where that comes from, that somehow they believe they're able to gain more leverage.
Like I said, then you're going to have a huge debate in the Black community when a Trinidadian who's, like I said, the descendant of Americans, who descendants of African Americans who were enslaved in the early country of this founding history. And you're going to tell them, no, you can't excuse me, but my ancestors were here too. They may have went to Trinidad and Tobago. They may have went to the Dominican Republic. They may have went to the Barbados.
Yeah, they disavow those arguments. They believe those arguments are either exceptional or they dis.
That is completely problematic.
Yeah, it is problematic.
Michael Myers, this is not making it more complicated. This is what you do at a negotiating table. This is what you do for public policy. Okay, I've written public policy report and public policy papers when I had to go to the University of Johannesburg. You have to consider all of that. Okay, you can't just say a broad brush. When these cases show up, you're gonna have to answer for it. And so that's what the point is going to be. When you say Liberian, if we say we're excluding it strictly to Liberians, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that excludes practically everybody else, because we can say, are you Liberian? Yes or no? That's all we need to know. Okay?
But you think that would give us greater strength? You think that would give us greater strength in the reparations argument?
Yes, it's just like, because then the ADOS and FBA argument would be, well, when Haiti asked for reparations for France, we're not going to be coming there asking to get Haitian reparations. No dip, Sherlock. You're not of Haitian nationality. You're comparing a tribe and a nationality are two different things. If you were an African American and you were living in Haiti and you were Haitian citizen, you would be entitled to them just as much as anybody else. I live in Haiti. I've been in Haiti for years. I'm a Haitian citizen. I have to deal with the ordeals that France was indirectly, may not have dealt with the full brunt of it, but I'm a Haitian citizen. Okay? Mm-hmm. You're not even living in Haiti. You're not a Haitian citizen. So you're comparing, once again, nationality and tribe are two different things. And I wish people would take the time, the effort, and the energy to break words down. People say, well, you're making it more complicated. No, I'm looking at it from all angles, not linear like you are thinking. I'm thinking of, okay, what happens if my parents are Muskogee, right? What if my family has only been here for this long? Because we assume that every Black American family has been here for 400 years, when the reality of it is America stopped importing Black American slaves in 1808. Okay, so let's stop this foolishness, okay? Some of us arrived on that plantation in 1790. Stop acting like you was living here for 16 nights. That's when the first slaves arrived there. All of us didn't show up at 1619. Some of us showed up in 1655. Some of us showed up in 1754. Some of us showed us in 1800. Heck, some of us even showed up in 1860 with the Clotilda. Are you going to tell the people of the Clotilda, well, you didn't go through 400 years of slavery. You was only here for 5 years. You don't know nothing about slavery. What are you going to say to them? It's a complete mockery.
And you believe that this off-kilter philosophy will actually harm their arguments
It's
in
just
regards
yeah,
to reparations and stuff.
it's just like Baruti I saw on Twitter. And this is why, I saw on Twitter the one of the founders of ADOS, Yvette Carnell, she posted an image of the red, black, and green flag, and then she brought up the flag that the flag was made by some Irishman. And everybody and people were retweeting her, roasting her, saying that's not even what the flag represents. The red, black, and green was invented by black people, but she put literally a tweet talking about it was made by some Irishman or the idea came from some Irishman. And this is the person you're saying we should leave reparations for. This is what you're bringing. The same people who say that we are indigenous Moors or aboriginals who can't even speak an aboriginal language, whether or not it be Navajo, Cachiquel, Powhatan, we're going to let these people dictate to us or negotiate reparations. I don't need somebody like that representing me. I need somebody who understands all perspectives and has done research on it all, not somebody who's done halfway and is particularly blinded by their anti-Africanness. I don't need that. So
Their
yes, it
points
does
are
weaken the point.
to state that they're not African. See, that's their whole point, to state they're not African, and they believe that stating that they're not African will somehow give them more leverage to the U.S. to say that they are so-called a part of the quote-unquote American social family. And this is a miscue that they are promoting in general. But because, as you say, a number of people have not read, have not researched, they believe this.
Yeah, it's deeply problematic. It's so, like I said, it's deeply problematic. And this is where Liberia, and this is why we should identify ourselves as Liberia. Because if we make the claim for reparations, we can say, hey, yo, America, you created Liberia.
Mm-hmm.
The fundamental example of your racism and your slavery is Liberia, and it still exists today. People can make the argument, well, you're not a slave. You were never a slave. Okay, but I can make the point that Liberia is still here today. I can make the point we still exist. Our flag is still up there. We still got a government. I can make
Yeah.
that point easily. This shows why we can't get over slavery. My country exists because of that.
Area needs additionally now. Let's say that a concentrated effort would be made for more African American people or Liberians, let's say, in the U.S. to physically repatriate to
Hold
Liberia.
on. Yeah, hold on. But before you get to that point, I just want to answer Michael Myers' point. He says, "Well, Yvette Carnell is not anti-African, y'all. She just has a stern stance on who should get reparations, and neither is Tariq." Um, I've seen a lot of Tariq's videos where he's made some statements about Africans and has made some condescending statements about Africans. So I highly question that too. And then he was the same person who made Hidden Colors in the Houses for Haiti, and then all of a sudden went on this FBA as soon as ADOS went on that argument. Look at what Michi X did. Yvette Carnell even made a video about Tariq Nasheed. Michi X did a point about Tariq Nasheed. Okay, so they have that thing within themselves. First of all, that point needs to be made. Okay. Secondly, you can make a firm point as to who should get reparations. Okay. But the point of the matter is, you said a specific group of people through lineage. Okay. You said lineage. Okay. Lineage is separate from nationality. Lineage is separate from nationality, and you can't compare the two. You can't compare lineage and nationality. You can't compare it. Okay, and that's what they're not getting. You can be strict on who gets it. Hey, you got to be the descendant of a slave. Okay, if I can prove that I'm a descendant of American slave and I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, I come from the Dominican Republic and I live here, I should get it. You should not exclude me because you say, well, you didn't go through Jim Crow. That's not the point.
Right. Well,
That's not the
right.
point.
Right. Well, how many, back to the Liberia question, how many additional people do you think that Liberia needs if we were talking about let me ask you like this, a migration of people to Liberia? Does Liberia need more people, or they just need more engagement from the African community that exists in the United States? I mean, given there are 50 million African people in the United States, do they need more people in Liberia, or they just need a further engagement over here as a trade base, as a resource base?
We need it more as a resource based. I definitely.
I think Jabari's screen froze initially, and then his signal might be interrupted. So I'll just kind of wait for a second until hopefully he's able to come back. But I was in the process, of course, of asking him, did Liberia need more people? And he was going through that explanation that more of a resource base from us here. Jabari, you still there?
Yeah, I'm still there.
Okay,
Um,
yeah, you were about to explain that you didn't necessarily think that Liberia needed necessarily more people on the ground there per se, but needed more of a of using the black population in the United States, African population in the United States as a resource base, either monetarily, skill wise, maybe a lobby or so. But I'll let you expand on that point if I captured that correctly.
I prefer, in my opinion, I prefer more boots on the ground than just a resource fund because you're going to need doctors and doctors need to be on the ground. You're going to need engineers and engineers need to.
How many people do you think that they need, or is just that's strategic? Basically, not an uptick in the population, but more of, as you say, boots on the ground.
I
What would
would
be the
say
major
at
areas?
bare I would say at bare minimum, it's gotta be, and I'm saying at bare minimum 250,000. Like at least 250,000, I gotta show up at bare minimum. If we talking about real like facts and statistics,
Right,
um,
right.
we gonna need millions. We gonna need millions. That's what we gonna need. We gonna need millions
Now,
of African Americans.
but is this to expand the population, or basically create a surge in skill talent to build the
It's
infrastructure?
both. It's increased in population, but also a surge in population. Because in order to increase economic growth, you need a labor force. You need a labor force, and you need a large labor force. And but if you don't have, in the case of Liberia, because it had the civil war, you don't have an educated labor force, an
Okay,
intense educated labor force. So now that you don't have a very educated labor force and you have a very small labor force, you need a massive influx of immigrants to come into Liberia to help develop it. This is one of the reasons why Liberia never industrialized. I saw something on Quora, and it was a great article. It was on Quora. He made a great point. I disagree with a lot of stuff he says, but he made this one point off. He said, industrialization requires a lot of labor. And he said cheap labor, or in the case he said free labor. But in this case, he said that the reason why they didn't industrialize is because the population was so small, you didn't have enough capital to industrialize off of that. So he brought up 2 points. You either had to bring a massive amount of African Americans who could serve as that investor class to industrialize the country, or you're going to have to find a way to expand the country to create the means and resources and skills to industrialize. So if you had a massive influx of African Americans moving to Liberia, you have enough money to industrialize off of, and we can start manufacturing simple things at first, just doing basic raw materials to manufacturing, and then we can start doing more advanced technological manufacturing. But you need the people on the ground, because one of the three basic tenets of economics is land, labor, and capital. Well, we have the land, Liberia. We have the labor, which will be the African Americans moving in, and also the Liberians there, but you need that human capital, and that could be monetary capital or human capital.
About physical capital as well, machinery that would come under money as well. But what would you say?
Machinery, gold, titanium, cobalt, coltan, that's physical capital. Off the land, of course.
Oh, okay. So what role do you think Black colleges could play?
I have to challenge Michael Myers' point. Africa is actually becoming Pan-African. If you've actually been doing research, Africa was planning to do a African passport this year. They've also passed the African Continental Free Trade Area, which will allow for over 54 countries to trade with one another, creating a single market. You have ECOWAS doing the same thing. They're trying to get the ECO away from France. They just got to make sure all the countries fill the criteria. You have the Southern African Development Community. You have the EAC doing their thing. They're trying to do a federation. So this whole idea that Africa is not Pan-African is ludicrous. There are Pan-Africans all throughout the continent. Julius Malema is one of them. PLO Lumumba is one of them. You have Pan-Africanists like Kemi from I think it's from Senegal, one of the Francophone countries, who was opposed to the CFA franc. You have Pan-Africans on the continent. So to say that Africa is not a Pan-African continent is just disingenuous. And you say that's why other groups are dominating and bullying the economy and its people. Once again, you don't know basic economics. If I do not have access to the human capital needed to extract resources, I have to get it from somewhere else. So unless the diaspora with the skills and the expertise to extract those resources, manufacture them, design them, you're not going to be able to build anything. You're going to need other groups to extract it. That's why you have different companies and firms come into different places. That's why America imports doctors from all over the world. America imports stuff from China. You need that expertise and skills. Since China and India are the two largest producers of engineers, you're going to need them engineers from somewhere. So who's going to come in and do it? You don't have access to it. And so people have got to be realistic about how geopolitics works. Yes, we have the resources. We have the gold. We have the coltan. We have all of it. But if you don't have those human resources, especially, and you don't have a financial system, you're going to have to sort of rely or align yourself with other countries. Be realistic and be practical about it. I'm thinking about this from all metrics, but go ahead.
What role do you think HBCUs can play overall, particularly the STEM related schools, North Carolina A&T, Florida A&M, Prairie View A&M, Howard University, for example, could play in this technology transfer or this technology design or infrastructure boost, along with the notion of having more boots on the ground? And is there a serious effort, you think, to do that? And I only mention that because I remember in the recent presidential election in the United States, there were various people who were running for president on the Democratic side that talked about HBCUs. And I wanted to just give, say, Elizabeth Warren's platform at the time. She wanted to, have, I think it was maybe around 80 billion or something like that, invested across the board into HBCUs, but that was for the point of expanding infrastructure so that companies would continue to be more attracted to sifting out graduates from HBCUs in that regard. But also, she wanted to, if I remember the plan correctly, to make it so that these companies would have to continue to diversify their workforce if they were getting grants from the U.S. federal government. And so, therefore, the beefing up of HBCUs in terms of STEM infrastructure completely, or as a comprehensive measure, would make these schools more attractive to getting graduates. And also these companies that wanted monies from the federal government would be attracted to get people from HBCUs as a natural pool source, because they were getting money from the federal government, and also the infrastructure would be beefed up. Now, given that type of sentiment and plan, and then, of course, Vice President Kamala Harris, when she was running, was also trying to come up with a similar plan, and others, as Elizabeth Warren articulated hers. Now, having said that, in some sort of way, what do you think would be the case, or could be the case, of a move for HBCUs to benefit if they were able to use their resources to help promote technology transfer to Liberia, assuming that this plan about the beef up of HBCUs regarding STEM infrastructure would take place in the U.S.? What would be your response to that?
To encourage that, it basically comes down to incentives. That's why you need boots on the ground, because then it allows for, the Liberian government to do whatever necessary, incentives, whether not they be intrinsic or extrinsic, to get HBCU grads to come over to Liberia to invest and start their companies over there. So an example would be making it easy for them to get access to business license, making it easier, make the ease of doing business a lot, increasing their ranking and the ease of doing business, having access to a little bit of capital, giving them access to land so that they could, have that land that they can use to either extract minerals, build infrastructure on, also giving them the support system. And since things are cheaper in Liberia, you can use that as sort of an advantage to why an African American should want to come to Liberia and let's stay in America, but also show that history and connection so that African Americans see that, that this is their country and they have an interest in it. Once that happens, you can then connect with HBCUs and create the HBCU to Liberia pipeline. There are some fraternities that even have a Liberian division there. So some HBCUs are reaching out. It's not much because people do not know the history much. And once that history becomes more mainstream, then I think that's when it will really kick off. But right now, most people don't know what Liberia is. They just know it's just a country. They don't know that it was founded by African Americans. They don't know that it has some of the two oldest universities in West Africa, Cuttington University and the University of Liberia. They also have William V.S. Tubman University. They don't know this. They don't know that history of it. So I feel like once you bring that up, it will definitely serve as an intrinsic motivator.
Okay. A final question that I had for you upon our dialogue here is, okay, so suppose that, do you think that when it came to reparations, the reparations argument, reparations either for slavery or to include Jim Crow onto that, or to include post Jim Crow United States, to systemic racism that affects the wealth gap between Black people and white people, to address all of that or any of it? You think should be directed at, there should be reparations for the country of Liberia? Or do you think that African American people should want to use reparations to build Liberia? Should that be a goal? Or what would reparations be used for in your mind most effectively?
See, and this is the problem where what the reparations advocates don't understand is that when they bring up Israel, they say, well, the Jewish community got reparations and stuff like that. Well, they're not taking into fact the consideration and the circumstances. Most reparations went to the Israeli government. Look up the 1952 West Germany Israel reparations agreement. That's where reparations to Israel, to the Jewish community for the Holocaust primarily went to. Some of them they might have given cash payments, but that's not where the bulk of the money went. The bulk of the money went to the state of Israel because that's where Israel represented the Jewish state. There were many Israelis who were opposed to it. As a matter of fact, there were riots. People were setting stuff on fire. If you've actually read about the West Germany Israeli agreement. And also the reason why Germany gave reparations, especially West Germany, was since West Germany during the time of the Cold War was aligned with the United States, Germany wanted to show the world that it deserved to be part of that democratic world. It was a way of them to show the world that we're on your side. We're on the side of the West, which was France, Great Britain, the United States, and NATO at the time. So that's why they gave the need to Israel, and Israel used that money to, build defense. Germany imported Mercedes there. So that's where the bulk of the reparations came from. People act like the Jewish community got individual checks. They didn't. Most of it went to the state of Israel. Now, how Israel has done itself, it is up for debate. We can have a discussion about that, but that's not the point. It's the same thing when people say with Darius. It's and before we get to the point of reparations for African Americans, right? People will bring up Japanese Americans. Well, Japanese Americans got reparations. Only 120,000 Japanese Americans got reparations. That's less than, at about that time, about 1 million or so Japanese were living living in America. We're talking about a small number of Japanese Americans getting reparations, and they only got $20,000. That only amounted to like 1.8 billion. You're not
Some
talking
people don't
about
think that they got reparations. Some people think they got compensation, and some people believe that reparations are
That's
nation.
that was compensation for their lost property, and that was also at the time of the America-Japan trade war in the 1980s, when Japan was the second most powerful country in the world. Okay, at the time, Japan was blowing. It was an economic boom in the 1980s, and America wanted to sort of get negotiations out of that. And Ronald Reagan, signed that reparations or compensation agreement with the Japanese Americans. You're talking about giving reparations to 37, 40 million Black people, okay? And you're talking about this, giving them hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you say it's going to be in the trillions of dollars, right? Okay. You're basically saying, like one person said, you say 14 trillion. Okay, the U.S.'s money is 22 trillion. If you divide 14 into 22 trillion, you're talking about like 60 to 70% of US GDP would be used for reparations. That's unfeasible. Then you have to factor in, okay, well, you said through taxes. Okay, Unless they cut massive funding in their industrial complexes, how are you going to make money for that? You're going to tax them really ultra high because the U.S. federal government's going to have other resources. And then secondly, you have to have a benefit. There has to be a benefit and a reason for it.
So so
Okay.
so so if I may cut in for just 1 second, if I may. So you would say that on a practical level, you think that reparations should be used, an argument wise, to fund Liberia
Your
States,
but
and the benefit for the U.S. would be that Liberia would be a trade partner, right, with the overall United States. So there would be an incentive to help to provide greater infrastructure if the argument would be made for a nation trading partner. Is that in part what you're saying?
that can be interpreted that way too. Also, to answer Jeremiah Holloway's point, so every Black America gets Liberian citizenship. That's what people are pushing. Like that's what we're pushing. I was talking to another Liberian who said that that should be the case because Liberia served as a homeland for African descendants and African Americans. So that is being pushed. So
Okay.
that's still being pushed. But yes, Liberia could serve as a strategic interest. So we can say to the US, okay, y'all don't want to stop y'all racism, y'all don't want to stop your own thing. Okay, here's what we'll do. We'll serve as one of your other adversaries, whether you like it or not, and we'll see how you respond then. And then it serves as a reason. Okay. And then therefore that's the benefit of it. Michael Myers said, Bruce Lee, it doesn't matter if it's economics. As an African American, you still say it's a must. Okay, yeah, we're saying reparations is a must. Nobody's denying that reparations are owed and that we should get reparations. The thing is called logistics. Okay, that's what y'all are forgetting. There's something called logistics. Okay, and we're thinking about the logistics of it. Okay, y'all making it seem like it's just okay, just cut the check. What? Like,
Right.
that's not how this stuff works. People who sought reparations had a negotiation with it.
Right.
Okay. And it has to be something that both parties agreed upon. Okay. The
Right.
reparations agreement that Israel got for the Holocaust was agreed upon by both West Germany and agreed upon by Israel. Okay. There were Israelis who were in the Holocaust who said, don't take German money because it was blood money. This is what I mean. You're not spending the time to actually look at each of these points.
Right.
And like one person said, it's called inflation too. You inflate all that money and prices are going to go up. Cost of living is going to go up. We're thinking about logistics. Okay. We're not saying that reparations is not owed. Nobody is saying that.
Right.
We're saying that the logistics of how it should be done is what matters and
Right.
what we're critiquing and what we're analyzing.
Right. I want to bring up one final point, if I may, to you. Last year there was a court case in which Namibia, country about the size of Texas or a little bigger, with about 2 million people in it. So I'm just giving the size of the country, but the small population was suing the German government for crimes of genocide in early turn of the 20th century, what was then known as Southwest Africa, for genocide crimes against the Herero and Nama peoples, particularly in what's now present day Namibia, in which the German government at the time, 1904, 1905, Southwest Africa, committed rapes. The German citizens committed rapes of the Herero and Nama peoples, put them in like desert-like concentration camps, and killed thousands of them, maybe eliminating up to almost half of their populations. So they were suing the German government for crimes of genocide. In fact, the trial took place in New York City, and so the German government never admitted to genocide. They just admitted to the notion that atrocities were given. So Namibia didn't receive quote unquote reparations, but what the by legal statute. But what the German government said that they would do, was they would make constant investments into Namibia ongoingly, which came to monetary investments, technology investments, etc. So perhaps Namibia is receiving reparations, but unofficially they are not in terms of the statute. And I only go back to that because they received, as a 2 million person country, they received a kind of a reparations and a settlement for their ongoing development as part of a nation. And that seems to be what you're saying in regard to Liberia when I brought up the question about reparations, that in fact, if Liberia was the focal point of the reparations, but we saw ourselves as African people and connected to Liberia, then the reparations that would go to expand infrastructure in Liberia would have residual effects on us, because we're talking about the creation of additional jobs, infrastructure, technology transfer on our part, along with some, political leverage by us being associated with a nation. And that seems to go back to the notion that when you said that that if we're not perceived as connected with a particular nation, that dwindles our leverage. So I wanted to make that comment to see if you had any pushback or any thoughts on what I just said, and if you have any kind of concluding remarks overall about what we talked about, or any specific comments to the notions I just made.
That goes to what Holipsism's point is on the screen. Reparations equals repairing a nation, not repairing individuals. No nation state, no reparations, period, point blank, end of story. And that's what it is. It was committed against the Herero people, but the Namibian government, which represents the Herero people, sued the German government. So they are the shoes that is used to represent the Herero people that were genocided and committed atrocities on. It's the same thing with the Israeli government. The Israeli government is supposed to be the the shoes for the Jewish people. It's supposed to be a representative of the Jewish people and be of a Jewish state. That's what Zionism is about. And
Are you
like I
saying
Tuber
that you
said,
saying the Liberian? You saying in this kind of mindset? Are you saying the Liberian government should be
yes,
the one to sue the United States government on behalf of Black people in the United
yes,
States? Is that what you're saying?
yes, yes. Yes, because Liberia then serves as the shoes for us. And like iTuber 01 said, make Liberia great again. But that's the point, because Liberia was established by African Americans, and we know this because the city of Monrovia is named after James Monroe. So when we go to the UN or we go to sue the US government, we can say, hey, the US, you created us. Our city is named after your US president. Our flag is representative of you. We represent the African American people and African Americans' interests. And so now the US government now has to look at us in our face. See, now the US government can't ignore us because now we're in the UN. We're now in different organizations, world organizations. So now you have to see our face and you're constantly reminded of slavery, because what we see in America is people say, well, oh, they're trying to, they're trying to hide slavery. Well, that's because you don't have a nation state. So people can just bury slavery and say, well, oh, the Civil War is over, all of that stuff. But once you put it in the context of Liberia, and Liberia being the African American government, then
And
we can
an
say no
existing
slave.
country, and an
Yeah, in an
existing country
existing
as well.
country, we can say no, slavery has never been over because this country was created because of slavery, and we are here to represent those people who went there, who died there, but also those people who never had the opportunity, who wrote letters and had their dreams cut. We, the Liberian government, are here to represent them. And then it changes the whole conversation. And this was actually put in the Africa report, where he was like, any racial reckoning in America must include Liberia. And that's the point. If you want a true racial reckoning, we cannot forget about Liberia and how it was created. And like
Okay.
iTuber said, in a perfect world, Liberia wins and US pays trillions XYZ years, which Liberia would use to set up the needed infrastructures to function like a modern country, water systems, electrical grids. That's how Israel got its money. That's how the Jewish reparations were paid. They got paid billions of dollars over years, and Israel used it to develop their infrastructure. They got received weapons. That's what it's used for. That's the purpose of a nation state, because we can then decide what we want to spend it on. Because one of the things that people think about when we have reparations, it's going to be an agreement. Okay, it's not like they're just gonna give you money and say, "All right, y'all just do what y'all want." Nah, there's gonna be, constraints with this. There's gonna be criteria with this, and also that was the same point. Well, Holup's point earlier about nations, right? That is why um, one person who made a reparations argument against African Americans receiving reparations, right? The argument she made was, she said, when it compared to Jewish people in the Holocaust, she said that that's different because it's between two nations. There was a BBC article that read that exact same point, and they used the point that we're making, nationhood. And she said the reason why the Jewish community for the Holocaust got their money was because that was between two nations, Germany and Israel. Liberia steps in at that point. Mhm. And like iTuber said, but in the meantime, we should assume reparations is not coming and get over to Liberia and get building ourselves outside of overcrowded Monrovia, or at the very least, invest from America. And Holub made a great point. He said in 1.8, um it ends at 1.8 started, sorry, my bad, I don't know, my words are stumbling. The state of Israel, starting in 2016, received $3.8 billion from the US for 10 years, and we can do that. So it's ultimately whatever we want. It's ultimately that's the benefit of nationhood. Um it gives you wiggle room.
By the way, one little trivial fact that you said, not forgetting about Liberia, um, the U.S. is only a part of a handful of countries currently that is still using the an adaptation of the English foot-pound system. Pounds, inches, feet, yards, gallons, where the rest of the world uses the metric system, grams, liters, etc. And so outside of the US, there are two countries that still use the foot pound system. One is Myanmar, and guess what the other one is?
Yeah, Liberia and Myanmar are
Liberia.
the only other countries. Yeah.
That's right. Okay. This has been great. I have learned a lot, and I have appreciated the opportunity to dialogue with you today. And I hope that the audience, like I have been thoroughly enlightened by your comments. I don't have any further questions for you, but if you have some final thoughts you'd like to give, that would be great.
Yeah, so the final points that I would make to all my BL family, to anybody who's listening to this, we have a claim to Liberia. It was founded by our ancestors. Many Liberians know about it. Many Liberians try to express the word. They try to get the message. So we should not be ashamed. That is our country. Our ancestors died there. Our ancestors wanted to go there. Our ancestors did go there, and they did build something. They built the two oldest universities in Africa, some of the tallest infrastructure, a tower in Africa. Okay, Booker T. Washington Institute was made there. You had Liberia having paved roads in the 1920s, early broadcasting systems. We were the ones. African leaders like Miriam Makeba and Nelson Mandela and Kwame Nkrumah went here. You should be proud of Liberia, and you should not have no shame about it. Yes, I rep Liberia. Like I told my Liberian brothers and sisters from the LIBAC, I rep Liberia. I rep the flag. I rep the Constitution. I rep the Declaration of Independence. You should too. You should read it. You should be proud of it. And don't let nobody misnarrative this country. You will not misnarrative, and I won't allow it, because I respect my country and I respect the contribution of my ancestors. To all the BL family, remember, like the Liberian national anthem said, written by an African American by the name of Daniel Bashir Warner, in union, success is sure, and we cannot fail.
I agree. In fact, on the ground in Liberia, I guess with the plan you've outlined, if reparations were if Liberia were the focal point of the reparations for slavery for African people in the U.S. to improve and expand Liberia's infrastructure, I guess people on the ground in Liberia will be all for it. So there will be, more of a team of people that are supporting the idea. I just wanted to say that as well as we end. So.
Mm-hmm.
So this
Yeah,
has been
and that
great. I
and a
appreciate.
quick side note, coronavirus ruined it, but they were supposed to have an anniversary, and they wanted to bring the NAACP, Black fraternities, and Black churches. This year was supposed to be the 200th anniversary of Providence Baptist Church, and they wanted to bring African Americans over there. Unfortunately, they were not able to. That was supposed to have been planned for this year. Let's hope they plan for it next year. Next year is the 200th anniversary of Monrovia. They say that they're planning to do their own year of return, and it's starting to gain traction. So let's hope and do that. Let's continue to push forward. I know I'll be pushing forward. And that's it. That's all I have to say. It was great talking to you, Mr. Baruti. It was a great honor and good job giving those challenging questions. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. And Harry, goodbye to you. Thank you. Perhaps we'll interface another time, but this has been an honor for me as well. And thank you for your time and your research efforts on this topic.
Bravo, Kwaheri. Nita Hitachi, Kiswahili. I really need to speak Swahili more. I need somebody to speak Swahili with, because I've been learning Swahili for a couple years, but I ain't not nobody to speak with. I got a couple friends, but I'm trying to get better at it.
I understand. Well, that is the Pan-African language, or so as thought by many people, and I think that's also something that we can, expand on too, utilizing Kiswahili as well, wherever we are, as African people, and whoever is an African, eventually that probably will be the case.
All right, Mr. Baruti.
All right, thank you, and Kwaheri also.
All right, fam. Hope you guys had a great live stream. Peace. By the way, hold on, wait. By the way, if any of y'all want to contact me, you can just email me at dariuslamb2018@gmail.com. If you want to talk to me, you can also follow me on Instagram at Jabari _legacy_boss. That's Jabari _legacy _boss, and you can get in contact with me. If you have any questions, let me know. But yeah, hope you guys had a great live stream. All right, Mr. Baruti, you have a great day.
Okay, same to you, Harry.
All right.